It's a film I've always admired, but never really liked all that much. Still, in honor of its 40th anniversary, I decided I'd finally take a stab at decoding one of the most widely discussed and popular movies in all of YouTube.
I want you to get up now. Get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "Run!"
This is an announcement, not a press conference. And therefore, there will be no questions.
Your newspapers, they won't tell you the truth. It's not in their interest to tell you the truth.
Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the Mafia.
It's too dangerous to them. If you want the truth in this country, you have to seek it out.
I'm still not the biggest devotee of Stanley Kubrick. I think he's fine. I'm certainly aware of the cottage industry that's been created around his work on YouTube, which makes me feel a little sheepish, adding yet more white noise to the conversation. The biggest problem with such lavish, almost cult-like attention paid to Stanley Kubrick's films is it reinforces the validity of a theory that should be more susceptible to circumspection: auteurism. Auteurism is largely the creation of one film critic whose heyday is now decades past, Andrew Sarris. The theory springs from a lot of novel ideas about cinema that were kicking around France in the mid-20th century. It posits the idea that a film's director is the controlling artistic agent of the film, and all their artistic motivations and achievements are ultimately subordinate to the director's vision, who has final say over the contours of the visual and narrative space. Furthermore, it's those persistent, recurring stylistic and thematic motifs from one film to the next that actually elevates a director from being a mere director for hire to auteur. If a director can imprint his or her, and who are we kidding, it's always a him, artistic essence across the whole of his filmography, he will become, with critical retrospective evaluation, an auteur, which in our common parlance is just shorthand for genius. And I think it's only natural for people so inclined to think cinema is worth thinking critically about want to cozy up next to a genius, auteur, and take a stab at decoding him. And Kubrick is like the Mount Everest in this sense. The ultimate challenge at the top of which rests the ultimate prize, at least in certain circles: intellectual cachet. It's the natural result of a higher education system that elevates novelty above all else, even while limiting the possible choice of subjects upon which such novel theories are deemed worthy. It's akin to the joke that 19th century literature is reducible to a mere handful of authors. The genius artists who birth unread monograph after unread monograph, acting like the queen bees or broodmares of academic detritus. To the extent that auteur theory means anything, look, there are so many other quality filmmakers that never get this kind of attention. Here's two. Sidney Lumet, whose work is nothing less than a chronicle of the slow spiritual disintegration of post-war middle-class existence and the rising tide of corrupt institutions and totalizing profit schemes. Here's another, Alan Parker, who just died in July of 2020, who might be one of the most interesting film auteurs ever because his major recurring thematic obsession, the marginal person on the fringes / the fish out of water in an alien environment, is carried through practically every genre of film, from musicals to thrillers to historical dramas. And in both cases, the filmographies are vibrant and alive, and maybe most importantly, accessible. Kubrick's studies online call upon modes of thought not dissimilar to conspiratorial thinking, precisely because the opacity of the work beckons the supercharged, pattern-seeking mind. And if we really believe that such scrutiny yields fruitful results, well, then the implication is pretty sick, but perhaps true all the same, that Kubrick is contemptuous of his audience to the core. He gets off on being oblique and creating blind alleys and red herrings. What he creates are not even films at a certain point, but... Look, it's not that I think Kubrick is just cold and unfeeling. I think he's aloof. His genius emanates from a profound condescension. Every movie is an attempt to evade the messiness of human existence that he holds so much contempt for in order to plant his true flag, the inscrutable yet infallible representation of the mind of the solitary genius. In a way, all auteur studies, of which the endless analyses of Kubrick's work on YouTube are an example, is a kind of codependent masturbation in which we as critics provide the hands and do all the work. And for the armchair theorists in room 237, this goes especially for you, because there is a tendency among the Kubrick studies folks to attribute intentionality to every blade of grass and grain of sand which populates the mise-en-scene. We have to get past this fawning adoration of Kubrick's intellect, his monomania, our perception of his preternatural attention to detail. You know what his biggest regret was toward the end of his life? At least according to the Warner Brothers documentary. It was that he made so few films, in effect that he was so cautious, so pedantic, so weird, that the sum total of his high-water creative output resides in at most 5 movies, from Dr. Strangelove to The Shining. And to be even more honest, the entire aura of Kubrick as genius emanates from one film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Squirrel that one in your back pocket, because I think 2001 is a very important film for understanding what The Shining is all about. Oh, and one last thing before we get started. I don't much care about Kubrick's intent. Things mean, and they do so because they are born into existence and create their own essence. A parent does not get to define the sum of meanings for his or her child, and neither does Kubrick hold The Shining in a vice grip of his own making. Long live the death of the author. So, as we begin this sojourn once more back into the Overlook Hotel, I want to call on 2 different quotes, which are in tension with one another, and as good little critics, I think that's where we need to be. This is from Twin Perfect's 4.5-hour essay on the Twin Peaks shows and movie, in which he says this:
Stick to obvious things shown in detailed close-up. Not everything is worth our attention. Not every little detail has so much value.
This is from Ed Seekov's Film Studies and Introduction, in which he writes, Film studies assumes that everything with the image has expressive meanings. Every detail is a statement of meaning, whether you want it to be or not. If I end up leaning more in one direction than the other, it will be more towards Twin Perfect's heuristic, if only out of a desire to help restore a sense of balance to the orgy of pedantry that has explicated every nook and cranny of Kubrick's film frame. Also, I'm taking to heart Frederick Jameson's analysis of Kubrick from his 1981 essay, in which he effectively folds auteur theory into another layer of his living thesis of postmodernism as an expression of late capitalism. He writes that for mass cultural productions like movies, the act of pastiche, as opposed to simple parody, is the deliberate reconstitution of elements of genre. He calls the practice in typical postmodern fashion meta-generic, in order to display, quote, the virtuosity of the practitioner rather than the absurdity of the object. Jameson is basically saying that as time goes on, the constraints of capital make the possibilities of both form and content narrower and narrower. And for the auteur, the only out remaining in order to be commercially viable is to pick up genres and play with them. The churning of capitalism severs the links between genre pastiches like Shining and the ghost stories of the past. The genre itself is dead, depleted, without meaning or reason. So Kubrick's genre film, as pastiche, self-reflexively acknowledges this sense of exhaustion. This is why we constantly puzzle over this movie. Are these ghosts? Or are they projections of Jacques' insanity? Or something else altogether? In other words, Kubrick as an artist self-aware of the demands on his reputation in the period of late capitalism has no choice but to f*** with us. With that caveat embedded in our heads like a meat cleaver, let's begin here. Oh, and before we go any further, I don't mean to dismiss all of the theories and explications of the movie's overall meaning. There are several compelling ones, and of the many I've seen, the two most compelling lines of thought for me are these. 1. That The Shining utilizes its setting and thematic elements to make a commentary on the atrocities of America's past, in particular regarding Native Americans, which comes across in the confluence of this
It's supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground.
and this. Let's call this the historical narrative track. The other track is decipherable from these juxtapositions. And here let me give credit to collated learning, which makes a very strong case that Danny's physical abuse is not a singular aberration from the past, but frequent and ongoing up to the present moment. And the abuse includes sexual abuse trauma. The Overlook Hotel is thus a kind of catalyst that brings into relief the ugly truths of the Torrance family. It further illustrates in the course of the narrative how the distortions and lies the parents carry with them about that abusive behavior have warped the minds of all involved. Danny's shine ability and his imaginary friend that lives in his stomach, fill in the blanks for yourself there, Jack's creeping insanity, and Wendy's self-delusion that ultimately cannot be avoided. Let's call this the interpersonal narrative. My attempt with this essay is to bridge these two very cogent interpretations, and there are more, many, many, many more, some of which are plausible, some not, and place them under a rubric that fits with the auteurism we are shackled to as film buffs. I want to understand why Kubrick, who had previously translated a work of provocative high literature into a cinematic cause célèbre, or created from whole cloth a work of oblique philosophical science fiction, decided to, according to the documentary, delve into middle-brow horror fiction in an attempt to garner commercial success, following the commercial flop that was Barry Lyndon. As Jameson, at least I think, is gesturing at, the idea that Kubrick had any interest whatsoever in doing a straight-ahead horror movie is laughable. And I think Kubrick aficionados all sort of understand that intuitively. So, where were we?
Mom?
Okay.
Yeah?
Notice something here?
They really won't go on
It's
that
kind of
hotel.
obvious, and yet I don't ever find anyone talks about it much.
It'll be lots of fun.
No, over here.
No. Remember, we're not doing room 237 here. So, when we first see Shelley Duvall's Wendy character in the apartment in Boulder, she's sitting at the kitchen table reading Catcher in the Rye. Just to jog your memory back to high school English class, Catcher in the Rye is the story of Holden Caulfield, a disaffected teenage boy of some privilege who's rebelling against the scripted life awaiting him after boarding school, or at least what was going to be before he flunked out. Here's how the book begins. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born, and what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me, and all that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. In the first place, that stuff bores me. And in the second place, my parents would have about 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told anything pretty personal about them. This is one of the most famous passages ever written in the English language about the pompous bullshit inherent in telling stories. Aside from that bit Shakespeare wrote about life as a tale full of sound and fury signifying nothing. Call this the Rosetta Stone of the movie, because it comes right at the beginning and it unlocks everything else to come. Huh. Well, that's something. Wendy reading this book announces all of the narrative gaffes, bad history lessons, and recycled lies that are embedded in the rest of the film, and how we probably shouldn't believe any of it. We are always being lied to, or lying to ourselves, and such is the affliction of being human. So how about a thesis statement?
Well, go on, smart-ass and Joe.
In The Shining, the act of humans expressing reality through narrative is deconstructed and rendered as a horrifying catch-22. For on the one hand, the inability to order events in a narrative sequence is to succumb to madness, a kind of Lacanian regression from the symbolic realm of language back into the undifferentiated real. But on the other hand, the act of storytelling itself is an acknowledgement, to someone like Caulfield's chagrin, of the impossibility of ever truly knowing what's real, because all narratives are at bottom some type of mistruth, or lie, if you will. Humans, therefore, are stuck with an impossible choice that must be made. To signify or not signify, that is the question. And depending on which choice you make, you either lose yourself, Jack in this story, or lose something essential about reality for the lie of history. Everyone else, except possibly Danny.
I think human consciousness was a tragic misstep in evolution. We became too self-aware. Nature created an aspect of nature separate from itself. We are creatures that should not exist by natural law.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Real pick me up. Just trying to stay positive. I want to exclude Danny here and perhaps Scatman Crothers' character as well, because these are the 2 characters who exhibit the titular shine ability. What is intriguing about the supernatural shine aspect of the novel and movie is how it doesn't end around language as the constitutive phenomenon of story. Because the mind-reading ability is so precise and particular and shared between so few people, it acts as a kind of private language, to borrow Wittgenstein's famous phrase, and thus perhaps completely subverts the Hobson's choice that all other human beings are compelled to make. So how does the movie lay out this argument about the impossibility of human progress through narrative? Well, we need to look at Jack. Who is he? Put simply, he's a man who's failed at telling stories. He fashions himself a writer, except we know he's never written anything substantial or even been published. We are told through Wendy that when Danny came along, Jack took a position as a teacher to support the family, which put his writerly ambitions on hold. This causes Jack to seethe with contempt and resentment towards both his son, who we can safely assume he physically and even sexually abuses, and Danny's mother, who as Danny's life giver is the ultimate reason for his career impotency, at least as he rationalizes it. In taking the job as winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel, Jack is at last able to hunker down and get into the business of lying on the page. I mean, writing stories. Except he can't do it. Why? I think the answer to that unfolds in many directions, and here are 2 of them. The story he tells about Danny's accident years before, and we're sure he's threatened Wendy to never divulge the truth of, is pretty obviously a lie. Jack is a child abuser, and he constructs false narratives to conceal that fact. The other story Jack tells is when Danny asks him about the Donner Party. Jack's unflinching candor when relating this tale of cannibalism, which, like most episodes of America's frontier history, is simply sensationalized bullshit that kind of misses the point. Michael Wallace's History situates the Donner Party within a larger historical period of manifest destiny, period in which the collision of peoples and cultures during westward expansion across the continent resulted in mass dislocation, loss of habitat, near species extinction, and recapitulation of the whole horrid mess in mythopoetic terms. Thus, in the character of Jacques, we get evocations of both the historical narrative and interpersonal narrative I mentioned earlier. The heuristic that encompasses both readings has to do with perception itself, which the film is really a commentary about. The present is shot through with events of the past, which can never accurately be recalled, because they reside in subjective space that constitutes perception with blunt tools, namely language and story. Conversely, the overlook is a repository for all of the events of the past, the ugly, cruel truth of them, which fester and linger like ghosts, if you will. I will be damned. When Jack has his interview with the hotel manager, Stuart, he's told about an incident 10 years before in which a winter caretaker named Grady went crazy with cabin fever and killed his wife and 2 children, ages 8 and 10. Except, of course, when we see the children as ghosts or hallucinations in Danny's mind, they are dressed identically, speak in unison with the exact same vocal inflection, etc. These are clearly twins, right? Or what? I can't find any reason to assume otherwise. And it seems, at least as far as I can tell, that we are meant to privilege Danny's perspective, his shine, as the most true thing represented in the whole film. Point being, the history and the visual representation conflict with one another. And this is not just some BS CinemaSin type continuity error. So in effect, Stuart has told Jack an inaccurate story. Or what we're seeing isn't true. But I get the sense this movie has its thumb on the scale for the efficacy of image over language. But more about language in a moment. The second clear example of Stuart's storytelling, i.e. lying, is when giving the tour of the property, he mentions that when the hotel was being built in the early 20th century, it was subject to Indian attacks because the property site was an Indian burial ground. This is typical cliched Wild West, Wyatt Earp, 6-gun, tumbleweed horseshit. We get a golly gee moment, roll our eyes, and assume it's more phony baloney for the tourist rubes. Moreover, Stuart's story is a kind of evasion, or substitution even, because the traumatic truth of the Indian settler conflict in Colorado is epitomized in one event, the Sand Creek Massacre. Much like the events of Wounded Knee a few decades later, the massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho in 1864 by the U.S. cavalry was a sickening display of both imperial ambition and localized brutality. 148 Indians were slaughtered, more than half of them women and children. Bodies were mutilated and burned. All of this after the Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle, had agreed to a peaceful settlement and relocated his tribe to the lands near Fort Lyon. By the way, after Black Kettle dragged his badly wounded wife away from the scene and regrouped his tribe, he wound up being killed 3 years later in another massacre ordered by this guy. So Stuart's story is a fairy tale, or maybe more to the point, a sick joke that everyone is in on.
Who left? I laughed my head off, otherwise I wouldn't be here.
But what everyone tacitly consents to in the telling is a papering over of the bottomless sense of despair, that queasy feeling in the gut that all of history has gone horribly sideways. Remember Holden Caulfield's recalcitrance to leaping into some BS personal history? It's not just about being a whiny teenager. Okay, it's kind of about that. It's about getting it all wrong and knowing that language as communication is always a kind of lie and not wanting to perpetuate the lie. Hence the fundamental irony at play in this movie. It's the whole legacy of TV and movie westerns, the myth of the frontier, George Custer and Little Bighorn, horror movie tropes that draw on the simultaneous fascination with and rejection of indigenous pagan cultures. Jesus, I could go on and on. So let's go on. After Jack's madness is fully set in, we get his first trip to the Gold Room. where, almost like a non sequitur that is winking at the audience, Jacques says this.
White man's burden, Lloyd, my man. White man's burden.
Kubrick is f***ing with...
Yeah, anyway, white man's burden is a kind of shibboleth, popularized by Rudyard Kipling at the turn of the 20th century, and meant to represent the trials and tribulations of noble British Empire, especially regarding its crown jewel, India. And all of this fits neatly, maybe even too neatly,
Kubrick?
with the thesis presented thus far, and with the tale Stewart's told the Torrances. Stewart's story is even more weighed down by the dominant decorative motif of the hotel, co-optations of native culture and dress. At one point, Wendy wears a coat with Indian design, as if these myths of the West are inscribing themselves upon the inhabitants. But the Overlook is a place of reckoning, where the ghosts of the past resist the fallacies of myth to the point of rupture. The lie we hold dear can no longer keep the lid on. The truth infects to the point of madness, at least for Jacques. Let's step out of the film for a minute and look at something more recent that typifies this sense of false feeling we grow so accustomed to. The Greatest Showman incorporates both classic Western themes of individualistic success with woke contemporary bromides about multicultural inclusion. And it's operating on at least 3 levels of mendacity all woven together. 1. The real P.T. Barnum was a piece of shit con artist who fully exploited his employees, grifted the public, and was cynically forthcoming about all of it. But the details of his life were swallowed whole by the persona associated with his greatest show on earth. 2. The makers of the film knew at least the rudiments of Barnum's unsavory history, and cynically removed those because they did not fit into the woke, uplifting narrative of an impresario who enabled the marginalized to let their freak flags fly. And 3. Audience reception for the film was overwhelmingly positive. And even in those anecdotal moments where fans of the film learned the truth of Barnum, or maybe even knew it to begin with, they didn't care because the songs are just too damn good. And they are good. Holden would have had an embolism watching this movie. And to connect this back to The Shining, we get the sense that some of the elements in the film are so self-consciously aware of their cliched mannerisms and actions. For example, have you ever wondered why the line readings in Kubrick's films can be so stiff and amateurish, like actors in an educational film strip from the 50s?
Best mother a girl ever had. I'm glad you like the dress, Joan.
Or this bit, where the imagined bartender speaks in a rote 1940s style patois.
No charge, dear Mr. Torrance.
No charge?
Your money's no good here.
Your money's no good here. Come on, let's go.
Again, back to Catcher in the Rye. J.D. Salinger writes in a vernacular of a glib teenager, using slang, profanity, and deliberate grammatical mistakes as an attempt to drill down to the truth of the moment. But this stylistic choice is very much an affect, both for the character within and the author outside, which serves to ironically conceal truth inside of artifice. The novel thus becomes art wrapped up in all sorts of knots of the sort Frederick Jameson is driving at. Oh, and I can't let this one go. In the movie Giant, the meaning of this expression is radically different, right? Same words, different contexts, and therefore radically different meanings. So now we've arrived at language itself, the contextualized, indeterminate core of narrative. So I guess we need to talk about theories of language. Don't be afraid, we're staying in the shallow end of the philosophy pool. basically because I would drown myself if we waded in too deep. By the way, the idioms I just used are a facile example of what someone like Jacques Derrida is trying to get at in his interrogation of the signifier-signified relationship. There is an obvious play of signification with expressions like shallow into the pool, because what I've literally spoken is not what I mean at all. But all language is afflicted with this curse of the ironic. Words always in some way or another spill out of the boundaries of simple unitary meaning. They are contaminated by other meanings, other significations, which can be traced back endlessly and which never result in a transcendental spokesman. The gender chosen here is deliberate, other than the one we just assume for the purposes of convenience. This imaginary transcendental signifier is the basis of all metaphysical thought, and all religion for that matter. Even as we strive for unitary meaning, someone to explain all of this shit clearly, God or whoever, we have to resort to language to do so, and language lives by creating binaries. If something is this, it's because it's not that. So the other, the absence, the lack, structures our comprehension of what is present, which you got to admit is a pretty f***ed up paradox. A kind of funhouse of signifiers endlessly projecting into each other, some of which are empty shadows. This means our understanding of reality itself, where we employ language as our guide and administrator, is always contingent, mediated, and therefore in a sense false, or to be as charitable as possible, ambiguous. But for someone like Jacques Lacan, a lot of Jacques today, could we get a little love for this one? Anyway, in Lacan's psychoanalytic framework, the basis of human consciousness itself, as it progresses through stages of maturation, is nothing less than entering to the play of signification, the realm of lies, as it were, which he christens the symbolic order. Lacan's innovation is to graft onto the post-structural dilemma of language the Freudian concept of desire. Desire, which is always provoked by a lack, is for Lacan what this jumping around of signification is actually about. Jacques desires fulfillment of his lack, and the horror, as it were, resides in his ironic placement as a writer who can't write. Because the main representation of his madness is the endlessly repeated phrase typed out on the typewriter. This is language cleaved from meaning because it doesn't proceed towards any greater degree of signification. The play of language as the reader makes meaning of it, deepening into imagined worlds of the story, has been shut off. The sentence does not proceed to new, novel expressions. All we have, and to Wendy's utter horrifying realization, is a repeated series of words that loop back upon themselves. The key word in the phrase he keeps banging out is play. Jacques can't play anymore in the post-structural sense, and thus is in full retreat away from the normal psychological ordering of reality for human beings. And while we're on this post-structural tip, let's look at Jacques' inverse, Danny's shine ability. Danny doesn't need language to communicate. Therefore, he is susceptible to the ghosts of the hotel and given insight about the truth of the past in unvarnished moments, most graphically the image of the slain twins. His unconscious dream state is not hampered by the necessary filters normally humans need to stave off psychosis. Curiously, Jacques too is affected by the unvarnished real of the hotel's past, the ghosts, but not by bearing witness like Danny, but by entering the realm itself. This is because Jacques can't shine, and therefore remains trapped in the prison of language to tell stories, a prison he cannot negotiate his way through. Hence, the madness. I contend it's because the crucial story he needs to tell, that of what he's really been doing with Danny, is the one he can't tell because it contains a lie at its center. In the world outside, where being polite and civil means a certain measure of concealment of the ugly truth of one's self or one's family is expected, the central lie can be managed, if you will. But again, the overlook, the place of eternal recurrence, where the past is resurrected and overwhelms story, language, our symbolic order, and the split consciousness of reality that constantly manages the cognitive dissonance between truth and lies. All of this means that the living history that Wendy and Danny represent, the truth of the Torrance family, cannot be suppressed anymore. As his madness deepens, Jack is set upon by the hallucination of Grady, who is now embodied as a waiter in the gold room of the hotel. Grady argues with Jack about who the caretaker of the hotel was, and thus who the killer that Stewart mentioned earlier might really be. At one point, Grady substitutes Jack for himself and makes him the murderer. At another, Grady acknowledges the vicious killing of his family, but euphemistically describes the murders as corrections. We, the audience, are thrust into Jack's subjectivity. The whole scene is designed to make our heads spin, to disorient us, to make us question the stories we've been told up until now. This is precisely the point. And with this line from Grady,
a nigger.
The almost stately, repressed Victorian vibe we've been subjected to up until now is exploded in an instant by the instantiation of the most reflexive, vexed, pernicious epithet in the English language. The word as used has an almost hypnotic power for Jack, like a code word that unlocks the inner demon hibernating inside of him, and the horror medium itself as a site for exploring the philosophy of language. We can surmise this as a possible explanation for why Kubrick would have chosen a middlebrow horror novel to base his art upon. It serves a much bigger purpose. Horror as a storytelling genre inverts the normal flow of narrative. If the flow in most stories is from harmony into conflict and back into harmonious resolution, for the horror story, the resolution often is disharmony itself. Horror is one of the few genres of film in which evil, a discontinuity of elements, an embodiment of chaos and disorder, gets to triumph. The chain of signifiers which we presuppose winds up at the last in some teleological warm blanket does not happen. We are left dangling, suspended, lacking. So now we are in the climactic final act. Jack is terrorizing his family, attempting to kill off his wife and child because of his psychic linkage to the real by way of the ghosts. Jack is now obsessed with mastering their ironic transcendental signifier, death itself. His death drive is now in high gear. But it is ironic because death is the absence of signification entirely, graying over the contours and distinctions that disaggregate reality and the difference. Death is the void. Death is nothing. Death. As Jack's mania mounts, he follows Danny into the one place where his signifying dysfunction cannot survive, the maze. I think it's important to note that the maze was entirely an invention of Kubrick. And the maze is doing a lot of metaphorical work to tie together all of these threads about narrative and language games. So let's step back for a moment. What is the metaphor? With any maze, even the ones kids solve at a restaurant while waiting on their chicken tenders and french fries, the object is to find the one correct sequence, the correct chain of steps, if you will, that leads you from beginning to end. What is that but the essence of narrative itself? Each step in the maze is a causal link that only in retrospect is made inevitable, because it is only at the end when resolution has happened that the route to the end appears unbroken. Think of it like a choose-your-own-adventure, but with only one successful outcome. Danny has been through the maze, story, before, so he has the benefit of hindsight and can find his way through again. Jack, once towering above the maze, a kind of god figure, perhaps the concept of man as a false transcendental signifier, is now forced into it. He cannot structure the sequences in the narrative. He has lost control of the symbolic power of language, and as he plunges deeper and deeper in his insane, murderous desire for Danny, he can no longer even summon words. Jack's unintelligible guttural noises represent his final judgment, a brute, ironic payoff to his failures as a writer and to the source of that failure, his own child, who has supernaturally defeated language. Oh, and one final cherry on top. The final shot, that excruciating push into the photo from 1921. It's an enigma, presupposing Jacques' eternal recurrence as caretaker of the hotel, destined to be part of its evil forever. But more crucially and less remarked upon is the date of the photograph, which all of you Kubrick groupies will insist must mean something, and I agree with you. It's a picture of the July 4th ball in the Gold Room, Independence Day, the Founding Fathers, America's foundational mythical narrative. The whole house of cards, in which as Americans, all of our other interpersonal and historical narratives are built upon. Exceptionalism, conquest, manifest destiny, triumph, tragedy, savagery, rape, mutilation, destruction, death. Our national lie. Story. And look, about that bit at the beginning castigating auteurism, let's return to it for a moment. If you want to believe in the concept, fine. With someone like Kubrick, it is almost impossible to avoid. I would suggest that the film's deliberate deconstruction of story and language fits in pretty nicely with this. You know, the cut that everybody wants to slurp Kubrick for until the end of time. Let's write that scene transition out on the page, shall we? The proto-human bashes in the head of a rival with a femur bone. He celebrates his violent dominance by throwing the bone into the air. As it descends, the bone morphs into a spaceship moving gracefully across the face of Earth. As written, this is patently absurd and juvenile. As image, it overwhelms with meaning and significance, which makes sense, coming as it does from a guy whose first love and first vocation was photography. Kubrick's thematic constant, at least from 2001 on, if not earlier, was in finding a way to defeat language with imagery, and a kind of desire to symbolize the Star Baby's evolution, humanity's path forward from the hell of its past. So I set out from a particular entry point, Salinger's novel of teen angst. It opens with a warning that any story we tell is bullshit, and then it proceeds to tell one anyway. I said this was a Rosetta Stone for the film The Shining, that in some way the film is exposing the concept of storytelling itself as a tragedy of humanity that we must endure, at least until one of us is whisked wordlessly away into another dimension and returns as the Star Baby. Catcher in the Rye's sense of truculence is also a Rosetta Stone for this essay, because the thumbnail and some of the clips used in this video were taken from Ready Player One. I think Holden would appreciate this.
Whoop-de-doo! What does it all mean, Basil? Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
Hoped you enjoyed our little romp through the post-structuralist meadow. If you like this video, please support our future content by subscribing to us at patreon.com/whyshotjrpod. Oh, and the Sex Pistols are a good segue into our next video.